The following series is my review and in-depth analysis of the Rareware Collectathon platformers for the Nintendo 64. The first of these videos will be covering Banjo-Kazooie. The second will focus on its sequel, Banjo-Tooie, and the final video will look at Donkey Kong 64. Some familiarity with these games is recommended before watching, and a spoiler warning for all three, of course. There's been a lot of hype surrounding the recent resurgence in 3D open-world platformer games. Several projects currently in development have risen to prominence based almost solely on their promises to breathe new life into the genre. Lobo Destroyo, A Hat in Time, and Yooka-Laylee, the most popular of these projects, all cite the same inspirations: Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, and Donkey Kong 64, all of which were created by British developer Rareware and released on the Nintendo 64. Ultimately, the reason for these new games' existence, and their main hook in generating interest and crowdfunding donations, is nostalgia for these so-called collectathon games of old. In the wake of all this harkening back to the past, I'm left wondering, is that nostalgia well-founded? What aspects of these games' design, if any, are responsible for the praise they continue to receive to this day? These are the questions I hope to answer with these videos. Without further ado, let's get started with the game that defined the genre. Banjo-Kazooie was released in 1998 to critical acclaim and commercial success, and was often compared favorably to other 3D platformers of the time. The game follows the adventure of Banjo the Bear and his bird partner Kazooie as they attempt to rescue Banjo's sister Tootie from the evil witch Gruntilda, who intends to steal Tootie's youth for herself. The game works from the very start to create a cartoonish, lighthearted aesthetic. The whimsical overture that plays over the opening cutscene, and the use of various tropes such as a vain, evil witch, as well as the fact that Gruntilda speaks entirely in rhyming verse, makes the game feel very much like a fairy tale. The game succeeds in establishing this atmosphere while introducing all of the main characters at a fairly brisk pace, with the entire opening cinematic only running about 3.5 minutes until the player gains control of Banjo. Following the opening cutscene is one of the better introductory sequences in any of the early 3D games of the 90s. Immediately after walking out of Banjo's house, the duo are met by Bottles the Mole, who gives a quick rundown of the plot and offers to teach them how to perform basic moves, giving the player the opportunity to skip these instructions if they wish. Skipping the training gives the player all of the basic moves and allows them to proceed to Gruntilda's lair immediately. But if the player accepts the training, Banjo is, at first, only able to move around and perform a very small jump. Each of their basic jumps, attacks, and other techniques are unlocked one by one by interacting with each of Bottle's molehills around Spiral Mountain. This gives a nice feeling of progression as Banjo and Kazooie smoothly evolve from characters with few control options to ones with many. The game also provides a tangible reward to players who explore and experiment in Spiral Mountain in the form of 6 empty honeycomb pieces, thus increasing the player's maximum life energy for the rest of the game. Each of these is unreachable without one or a combination of Bottle's basic moves. This is a great way to structure a largely optional tutorial by giving an immediate and practical use to the moves being taught. After the player has learned all the basic moves, they're able to enter Gruntilda's lair. Doing so triggers a short cutscene of Gruntilda preparing a machine to steal Tootie's youth and beauty. Although this cutscene's main purpose is simply to give context to the game over cutscene, it's short, skippable, and also serves as a nice buffer between Spiral Mountain and the lair, appropriately conveying the sense that the game has now truly begun. Upon first entering the lair, players are quickly introduced to the main mechanic by which new levels are opened. Banjo and Kazooie must collect golden jigsaw puzzle pieces, called jiggies, and place them into puzzles depicting the game's levels. When a puzzle is completed, the corresponding level can be entered. It's a fairly simple mechanic that becomes easier and faster to use as the puzzles require more jiggies, which is a nice consideration. The puzzle for the first level requires a minimum of effort, with Bottles outright telling the player where to look for the single jiggy it requires if they haven't found it already. This is fine, as it conveys the level opening mechanic to new players without beating more experienced ones over the head with it. Earlier, I said that Banjo-Kazooie has one of the better introductory sequences of its era, and I include Mumbo's Mountain, the first proper level, in that appraisal. Mumbo's Mountain works very well, not only as a first level, but also as a continuation of the tutorials started in Spiral Mountain. Its physical design is simple and mostly straightforward, which is good for beginning players, and through the use of a few shortcuts, it avoids hampering the playthroughs of more experienced ones. A stone path leads the player from the entrance forward through the level, passing by and through each significant section of it. What I like most about this path is that it ends up leading the player to the most useful and significant move to be learned, and if the player deviates from it at any point, there are no real dead ends. They can always accomplish something toward the completion of the level, regardless as to the moves they've learned so far. Only the slopes place collectibles completely out of reach, and if the player attempts them, they're prompted to find bottles to learn how to traverse them. While the player is free to explore the level however they like, it's ultimately designed to direct them to the area where Bottles teaches them the Talon Trot, which isn't so much a move as it is an alternate mode of movement. In that sense, the Talon Trot is far more than just a method used to ascend slopes. I would even go so far as to say that the Talon Trot is one of the most important and impactful moves in the entire game. It reflects what I see as one of the central tenets of Banjo-Kazooie's overall design, which you may have also noticed so far. A duality that caters to players of both high and low skill levels. This is reflected in many other aspects of the game's design as well. All of the tutorials and opening cutscenes are skippable. Character dialogue can be sped up by holding the A button, and can be skipped entirely by pressing L, R, and B, a combination that's extremely unlikely for a player to use accidentally. The deliberate design of the game to be accessible to players of multiple skill levels extends beyond dialogue and tutorialization, however, and the Talon Trot is one of the best examples of this. It's clearly faster than Banjo's normal running speed, and as you might expect, the added speed alters the player's jump arc. A full speed jump in this mode requires much more commitment to the direction and length of the jump. This might sound like common sense to anyone who's played a platformer with a run button, but Banjo-Kazooie's use of it is slightly deeper than that. Unlike a run button, the move ultimately offers no benefit in terms of platforming aside from speed, thanks to the inclusion of the double jump. Kazooie's jump in this mode covers the exact same distance as the double jump, with an added skid at the end. This ensures that players can cross the same gaps that they could without the Talon Trot, and vice versa, with the skid after jumping adding an extra degree of risk. This effectively gives players a choice between the faster, riskier Talon Trot, or the slower, safer, normal movement mode. This adds an extra layer of challenge to the game, as very few areas outright necessitate the use of the Talon Trot. Furthermore, the player can only remain in this movement mode by holding the Z button, meaning they must make a conscious and deliberate choice to take the risks associated with it. The fact that Banjo's normal movement speed is almost always an option also means that less skilled players will have a fallback when the higher speed makes things too difficult. In short, the Talon Trot is a brilliantly implemented move that, rather than just being used for context-specific problems, increases the depth of Banjo-Kazooie's gameplay. The fact that it's introduced in the first level and required to advance any further in the Lair makes it all the more impactful on the game as a whole. The game's accessibility across skill levels is also highlighted by one of the more intelligent decisions with regard to tutorialization. Any collectible being picked up for the first time triggers a short piece of dialogue explaining that object's significance, but only Jiggies cause the gameplay to be paused for this explanation. All of the others allow the player to move freely while the dialogue proceeds, which is great for keeping the game moving. Although it's somewhat disappointing that the same idea wasn't applied to Jiggies, it's clear that the developers intended to make collecting a Jiggy a much more significant event. This is evidenced by the short animation that plays each time Banjo collects one, though I'm not sure that this animation was the best idea either. Generally speaking, a developer should minimize the number of gameplay interruptions, or at least allow the player to skip them or speed them up. Although the animation and accompanying jingle give a sense of satisfaction at having completed something, by the time the player has collected 60 or 70 Jiggies, which works out to about 5 solid minutes of interruption by this animation alone, this aspect of Banjo-Kazooie definitely starts to wear out its welcome. Perhaps a better alternative would have been to only play the animation for the first and last Jiggies collected in each level. Although I've introduced Mumbo's Mountain as a fairly stellar first level so far, it certainly isn't perfect. One of the first enemies encountered by a player following the path is the bull, which is among the only enemies in the game that can't be killed. It seems a bit backhanded to place an invincible enemy at the beginning of the first level. While it's possible the bull's inclusion was to make it more likely for a player to take damage, and thus increase the perceived usefulness of the beehives, it serves no real purpose aside from this. It's trivially easy to avoid, can't be interacted with in any meaningful way, and is one of only 3 such enemies in the entire game. The level also introduces the transformation mechanic, but in a fairly lackluster way. This is because the level only contains 5 Mumbo tokens, the exact amount needed to purchase the transformation. This means that if a player misses even one of the tokens, they can't fully complete the level. Although the tokens aren't particularly well hidden, it strikes me as a very odd decision to only supply the player with the bare minimum, while other levels that completely lack a transformation have plenty of tokens. Perhaps worst of all is how easily this could have been avoided. Simply adding more tokens to the level, or indicating to the player that all 5 tokens could be found in the level, would have alleviated this. Although this on its own seems like a minor problem, it leads into the biggest flaw of Banjo-Kazooie's introductory section: musical notes. Notes collected in each level count toward a note total, which is used to open note doors and advance through Gruntilda's lair. Leaving a level or dying inside it resets all of the notes and sets the counter to 0 while saving the player's new high score, if applicable. I'll be discussing this mechanic in more detail later on, but for now, it's important to point out just how poorly this concept is introduced to the player. Specifically, the fact that notes are reset after the player leaves the level is only made clear after the player has already left. There's no good reason for this, and compounding the possible issue of players missing a Mumbo token and leaving the level to search for more is the Witch Switch, which spawns or reveals a Jiggy in Gruntilda's Lair. Because of the huge emphasis placed on the collection of Jiggies, it's likely that a player might leave the level to retrieve it, only to find much of their progress unexpectedly lost. This is a huge misstep, and it's baffling that such a decision was made, when it would have been just as easy to warn players before they leave a level exactly what the consequences of that action will be. Thankfully, recollecting notes is relatively easy on Mumbo's Mountain, but for a game to make such a huge mistake, when up to this point it was so effective in its teaching, is disappointing to say the least. The second level, Trove Cove, represents a dramatic shift in terms of level design. Whereas Mumbo's Mountain presented the player with a straightforward path, Trove Cove immediately branches off in different directions, essentially forcing the player to discover it at their own pace. Although 2 new moves are available to be learned, it's entirely possible for players to accomplish a great deal without these moves. Its physical design also ensures that there are no moments of frustration because a collectible is in sight but out of reach for lack of a required move. Its setting on a tropical island gives the level a natural brightness, and allows it to be surrounded with ocean rather than being walled in, which lends the environment a lot of openness. Snacker the shark, who attacks the player when they swim in the ocean, is useful not only as a rather lenient punishment for falling into the water, but also serves as a boundary that feels far more natural than a set of invisible walls. Trove Cove, through its expansive but accessible level design, encourages players to search thoroughly for collectibles by placing them in more out-of-the-way locations. Its Jiggies in particular generally require far more legwork than the Jiggies in Mumbo's Mountain, the Hidden Treasure Jiggy being the best example of this. The level places an emphasis on its verticality, and this makes it feel much larger than it actually is, as much of the three-dimensional space is occupied by the non-traversable mountain arch. This is actually a point in its favor, as it retains a feeling of largeness, but it never becomes frustrating to retread old ground. This is partially because backtracking never takes too long, and partially because so many areas are accessible in more than one way. The large green brick structure, for example, can be climbed in the front through the spring jump pads, or in the back via a series of ladders. Trove Cove's most notable use of its emphasis on height is the introduction of flying. Early beta footage of the level shows that initially, players were able to begin flying at any time, and I think the decision to limit flying to the flight pad was definitely the right one. Flying is a very satisfying and empowering way to move about a 3D world, but it largely trivializes the idea of a game based on platforming. From what I can see, 2 considerations have to be made in any platforming game that features flying as a non-primary mechanic. First, players should not be able to fly wherever or whenever they choose. And second, ascension should always be limited in some way. Banjo-Kazooie achieves the first by limiting flight to the flight pads, and it achieves the second by requiring the use of collectible red feathers for ascension. As an offhand example, Super Mario World only marginally satisfies the first requirement by necessitating a running start, but it fails to address the second, as a player can essentially gain infinite height with the cape if they have good timing. This leads to many of the game's levels being made trivial with the cape, except for those designed specifically to stymie its use. Although these rules aren't universal or foolproof by any means, it's important nonetheless to consider how deeply a flying mechanic can affect the gameplay of a platformer if it's not kept in check, and I think Banjo-Kazooie handled this well. Ultimately, the inclusion of flying does impact some of Trove Cove's design by making some Jiggies far easier to reach than was obviously intended, but in a way, it almost feels like an alternate method of completion rather than a cheat. The abundance of flight pads also means that once the player has learned to fly, it's fairly easy to get just about anywhere in the level, thus making things less repetitious even if the player has to backtrack multiple times. Although I don't intend to make this review into a level-by-level commentary, I felt that Trove Cove's design deserved a slightly deeper analysis. It's a perfect representation of the open world concept done right, and as a result, it's one of the best and most memorable levels in the entire game. One of the biggest issues for many 3D platformers of the era was the camera. Banjo-Kazooie was fortunate enough to be released 2 years after Super Mario 64, by which time many players had a better grasp on 3D games and the idea of a disjointed, controllable camera. However, the problem of implementing a camera that shows a useful view of the game was only compounded as games matured. More complicated level geometry, coupled with an increase in movement options, made designing a functional and unobtrusive camera a daunting challenge. Fortunately, it seems that Banjo-Kazooie rose to that challenge. The game's camera system is surprisingly nuanced, at least far more so than it may appear at first glance. The camera controls are fairly intuitive, making use of the C buttons in much the same way as Mario 64, with a few key differences, all of which I see as vast improvements. The left and right C buttons swing the camera around Banjo and Kazooie in what appear at first to be discrete amounts of 45 degrees, but a closer examination revealed that it wasn't quite that simple. Note the position of Banjo's head relative to the small outcropping of wall in the background. After rotating the camera around Banjo to what appears to be the most similar angle we were at before, it's clearly moved slightly less than a full 360 degrees, with each successive full rotation resulting in Banjo being farther away from the outcropping. In addition to this, camera swings are much less rigid compared to Mario 64. An interesting property of this method of motion is that they can be interrupted with another camera swing in either direction. The consequence of these two changes is that the camera can be placed at a far greater number of angles using the C buttons, resulting in more dynamic and useful views of the world. The game also allows the player to move the camera behind Banjo using the R button. Mario 64 had a similar function, although this again had a much more digital feeling to it, and represented more of a switch between two alternate camera views than an actual camera control. In Banjo-Kazooie, pressing and holding the R button causes the camera to swing behind Banjo, following him as he moves, and stopping when the button is released. In effect, this gives the player a quick way to orient the camera using the analog stick. Full analog control for a 3D camera would obviously be preferable, but Banjo-Kazooie makes excellent use of the tools it has, and improves upon Mario 64's camera controls by making them more dynamic. Banjo-Kazooie's camera also succeeds at knowing when to take camera control away from the player. In certain areas, the camera snaps to preset angles and locations, usually to bring an object or area of interest into view. Smaller subsections of levels also do this to prevent the camera from getting in the way in locations where there's less room for it to maneuver. Some of these smaller areas have multiple angles or give the camera a limited range of free motion. The best kind of camera in any game is one that the player doesn't even need to think about, and it's clear from the layouts of these sections that the developers knew this. They've clearly been designed with the restricted camera in mind, and it ends up being executed so well that most players likely won't even realize or mind that the camera controls have been locked. A slightly more subtle and impactful addition to the game's camera is the manner in which it prioritizes its position. Simply put, in areas where the camera has the room to move freely, it pans to show more of the level in the direction that Banjo is currently facing or moving. This decision is based on the reasonable assumption that giving the player a better view of where they're going is more important than keeping them in the center of the frame. This is a crucial consideration for 3D platformers, which tend to require a good deal of precision when it comes to movement. A similar technique was used in the Donkey Kong Country games, also made by Rare, and it translates to 3D quite well. To me, both this and the fixed camera segments are the best kind of design element. They feel so natural that I never even noticed them in any of my regular playthroughs. This subtle nuance to the camera highlights one of the things I like most about the game as a whole, which is the feeling of its movement. It's an aspect perhaps best reflected through the unexpected nature of the game's level design in relation to its genre. Despite being a platformer, it's surprising how little platforming there actually is, at least in a traditional sense. Looking specifically at the 9 main levels, there are only a few moving objects used as platforms, and only a single bottomless pit in the entire game, despite both of these elements usually being a staple of the genre. What's even more surprising than this is how enjoyable the game is without them. The lack of bottomless pits gives the game a much more relaxed atmosphere, as the threat of instant death is greatly reduced aside from fall damage. The small number of moving platforms is the biggest contributor in terms of level design to the game's distinctive feeling of movement, which places a huge emphasis on fluidity. Although moving platforms tend to increase the level of skill and timing required on the part of the player, the fact that Banjo-Kazooie largely avoids using them means that much less time is spent waiting and planning. Instead, the levels focus on traversal and movement as a whole, to the point that there are very few moments in any level where the player must come to a complete stop and wait. This near constancy of movement and action is a huge point in the game's favor, as the game's control style meshes with this design philosophy extremely well. Although it's possible to move about slowly, Banjo and Kazooie's positive acceleration is practically instantaneous. Drastic changes in direction are quick and effortless, and all but the most serious movement mistakes rarely result in a loss of speed. Compare this to a game like Super Mario 64, for example, and the difference becomes obvious. Even narrow platforms that are made hazardous with enemies lurking inside the walls can still be traversed without any great change in the player's overall momentum. They aren't entirely trivial either, however, as they still necessitate a skillfully timed attack. The result of all of this is a game that feels very smooth and satisfying in its control. Because the levels complement this control style, rather than combating it with constant stopping and waiting for moving platforms or other hazards, the developers managed to make the simple act of moving about a level into a fun and engaging experience. Bubblegloop Swamp, Freezeezy Peak, and Gobi's Valley collectively represent the middle of the game, and an appropriate uptick in the difficulty curve. Enemies become more dangerous and resilient, puzzles become more involved, and the level design starts to incorporate surfaces that harm the player on contact. While these surfaces reasonably escalate the difficulty by serving as a middle ground between safe terrain and instant death traps, I do have an issue with them in regards to conveyance. Specifically, there's no way for a player to know that these surfaces are harmful until they've already taken damage from them. The bridge above the first appearance of the swamp water is a respectable attempt to teach the player wordlessly, but the fact that the previous level was a sewer works against this attempt to dissuade the player from jumping into the water. This problem is especially bad in Freezeezy Peak, as its water looks identical to the rest in the game, but behaves differently with no indication or warning. Worst of all, the design of the lair ensures that players will have learned how to use the rubber boots by this point, meaning that the developers could have easily avoided this by placing a small stretch of water at the beginning of the level with a pair of boots next to it. This issue is admittedly minor, but frustrating simply because it seems like such an amateurish mistake, with a number of possible solutions, all of which would be trivial to implement. Bubblegloop Swamp is the second level to feature the game's transformation mechanic, and also the one that uses it most extensively. Unfortunately, that's not saying much, as I feel it's greatly underutilized overall. Aside from the fact that only 5 of the levels feature transformations, none of them add any major change to the way the game is played, with the possible exception of the bee. In most cases, the transformations end up being more restrictive than additive to the player's experience by taking away all of Banjo and Kazooie's moves and doing little to replace them. A common aspect among most of them is the ability to enter small holes and gaps, and immunity from otherwise harmful stage hazards. The crocodile transformation in Bubblegloop Swamp eliminates the hazardous nature of the swamp water, facilitates the collection of a few items in small gaps, allows the player to attack by biting enemies, and enables the player to access a short minigame. Then, consider the fact that a transformation from much later in the game, the pumpkin, actually has less utility than this, its only abilities being the fact that it fits in small gaps, and immunity from a harmful surface, both things the crocodile could already do. All that being said, the transformation mechanic is a good addition, and the game would be less interesting without it. I just can't help but feel that had the game used transformations more extensively, and had it changed the core gameplay more dramatically, with the crocodile minigame being a good example of this, it could have been a much more noteworthy element. Visually speaking, Banjo-Kazooie is a very rich and colorful experience. Textures are varied and appealing to the eye, and the amount of detail that can be shown on screen is impressive considering the technical limitations of the time. For the most part, the game runs quite smoothly as well, and I only experienced one noticeable slowdown throughout my entire playthrough. Where Banjo-Kazooie succeeds most in terms of visuals is its effective use of color. Most palettes in the game are rather saturated and somewhat limited in size, which suits the cartoonish storybook tone of the game quite well. Mad Monster Mansion and the various seasons of Click Clock Wood give a great sense of how well the game uses color to establish different atmospheres. Also of note here is the design of the protagonist. Banjo and Kazooie make for a charming and novel duo of characters, and they fit in well with the rest of the game's style, but what's most striking to me is their coloration. It's a fairly common trope in visual fiction for protagonists to feature predominantly primary colors, with antagonists trending towards secondary colors. Banjo-Kazooie is no exception to this, but I can't help but feel there's a slightly deeper intention to the coloration of Banjo and Kazooie's model. Banjo is brown and Kazooie is a bright reddish orange. Banjo's backpack is blue, and his shorts are a bright yellow. In other words, their design prominently features all 3 of the primary colors. This, combined with the relatively limited palettes of the individual levels, means that regardless as to Banjo and Kazooie's surroundings, at least one part of their character models visibly stands out. Few things are as important in a 3D platformer as having a precise idea as to where your character is within the world, and even though it's not likely that these color choices meant the difference between precision platforming and the protagonist being invisible, it's a good decision nonetheless,